Welcome to Rauta, welcome to Crash Course to Norwegian Black Metal from the 90s. I am Jerry and this time I'm gonna talk to you about some of the cult acts that may have, or may have not, gone under the radar back in the days when people were finding out about Norwegian Black Metal to begin with. Now long gone in this series are the bands that are actually big, successful and well known. I mean, along the first episodes I went through the names that everybody knows, including but not limited to bands like Burzum, Darkthrone, Dimmu Borgir, Immortal, what have you. Now, since we're already going towards episode 20, and that is roughly the last third of this series, now we're among the cult ones that a lot of people know, that is, who have been following the Norwegian scene for a long time, much like me and people like my age, but which are not the names that so many people know. I mean, nowadays I would make the wild guess, a certain kind of educated opinion, I guess, or whatever, that a lot of nowadays newer names are more known versus these bands that were already operating in the 90s but never made it big, successful and all that stuff. And there are of course various reasons why some of these bands are not that known. Maybe some of them really had bad lineup problems, maybe they split up once upon a time only to come back later, or maybe they were not touring that much. We all know a bunch of different things affect how certain bands are more or less known versus some bands that might have good quality music and all that stuff never made it to big ones. So we're among the cult names, and the bands today are Wallachia Nidingr and can you guess the last one? I guess it was already mentioned. Okay, let's go to the list in question. It's Mactätus we will start with, and that is actually the first one in this episode. And if you're wondering what makes me to decide the order of the ones, I'll go from the bands that were oldest of the trio, that is started before the others. And Mactätus is actually one of those names that started already in the 80s. And there are not too many black metal bands from Norway from that era. And of course, what is very much true with Mactätus and likes of those bands, they either didn't do an album back in the 80s, of course. I mean, bands that started in the 80s, you can pretty much count them with one hand's fingers. I mean, we're talking about mainly bands like Darkthrone, Mayhem, Burzum, Thorns, and not much beyond. But there were few, and most of them didn't do much before 1990s. I mean, it's kind of a given when they started in 1989. So, young guys in the game and all, of course it takes some time to figure out what you're actually doing before you enter the phase of doing first demo and all. Now, as always with this series, I've mostly focused on the albums because they're one that define the bands as such more than demos, which might have had an impact before the album era, but it goes beyond the scope of this video series. So first one in the question is Blood from 1997. Mind you, that is about 8 years after the band was founded, which gives you a lot of information, gives you a kind of insight what was going on back in the days when bands were started. I mean, nowadays you can hear bands that started in like 2021 and during the same year they already have maybe even an album out. Bands are so hasty to get into doing things. And of course it's so much easier when everybody can just pick their smartphones and laptops and tablets, iPads, what have you, not to mention proper computer settings in order to record whatever, albums, demos, what have you. But that wasn't really the same back in 1990s. You actually had to first of all rehearse the songs. You had to have a steady lineup, which isn't that different from nowadays. But you actually had to probably pile up some cash in order to book a studio rather than, dragging some 4-track recording device to your rehearsal room and then get it started. And these are some of the reasons why it took so much time for bands to really record something worthwhile, something to remember them by. And in my opinion, Mactätus really didn't waste that chance with their debut album, which I think is still their best so far. Now, Blood came in 1997. But by that time, a lot of Norwegian scene had already started shifting away from whatever it started with. I mean, whether we talk about the early birds of the scene, the ones that I already mentioned, or something that came a little bit later, but by the mid-90s. Black metal by 1997 was very, very much solidified, cemented into the pages of history. A lot of bands were already like touring, had multiple albums out, so Mactätus came a little bit late to the party. But their first album is actually pretty good. It's not exactly most original out there. However, I would say it's more original in a way than some of the albums that came later on. Or maybe it's unoriginal, but for better reasons than the albums that came later on. And I'll explain it why. First of all, this album is somewhat we call nowadays very typical 1990s second wave black metal. It has synthesizer, it has melodies. It is not the rawest out there, it's not the symphonic kind, it's not the atmospheric stuff, but very much in the middle part of Norwegian black metal. You know, I was actually plowing snow maybe some 2 weeks ago when I was listening to this one, and I was like, man, they got something really, really nice started here. Whether we're talking about the production values, how it sounds of the era, whether we're talking about, you know, riffs used, melodies, synthesizers, everything here is moderation. It's well balanced and things kind of like fall nicely in their place. And while it's not exactly original, I mean, you can pretty much figure out a lot of bands that have similarities. I mean, it's very, very typical Norwegian or Nordic black metal one. It has something nice going on. It still feels like this is an album, maybe with different production though, that could have been done some 25 years later, and you wouldn't feel like it's weird. It's not even like retro-ish sounding in that respect. However, the band was kind of bound to change its style, and in my opinion, way too quickly, whatever came after that. So in my books, I would say Blot is their best album. However, Provenance of Cruelty, which came out like a year later, isn't that different. I mean, it's already kind of shifting, it's progressing to some degree, but because, I guess, the albums came so quickly back to back, the change is not that different, which makes this rather nice addition to Blood. I mean, it's kind of a clear successor. Some, I would say, elements were lost and some were gained. The quality, in my opinion, isn't that big, but it's kind of noticeable that the band is already going to a different direction. Now, 2 years later, which is not that much, but enough to make a big difference, the complex Bewitchment. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's 50%. It's not a horrible album, in my opinion, but it's kind of a mediocrity. And the album cover is like, what are you thinking? Like, this seems like a joke or a satire parody thing going on. I mean, are you gonna go after Cradle of Filth things with your cover and all? Unfortunately, that the same thing is with the music. It seems like suddenly this is a different band, and suddenly they're like, let's abandon whatever we got going on with the rather Nordic take of things and went to the UK style of black metal, which is mostly Cradle of Filth, but I would say some people would name Hecate Enthroned and the like from that era, mind you. This is still more than 20 years ago. And the Complex Bewitchment is almost like a different band in the sense, like the songwriting is different, synths are now more overboard, and to be honest, they're not that good. It's almost like, let's add so much keyboards on the play that it doesn't really sound like a black metal album so much as the previous ones. It's like, let's go after the success of Cradle of Filth. I don't know if that was true, but that's the feeling I'm getting nowadays. I must say, back in the days, I didn't hear this album, nor at least I had no recollections. Blood I remember hearing way back, but the other ones, they kind of, I don't know, went under the radar, so to speak. Now, 2 years later, after that, came Suicide. So far, the latest album. And this is almost like, okay, let's go like Dimmu Borgir and things like, let's start building bigger, more synths and more kind of orchestrations with the lack of budget and all. And yet they have kind of edgy song names like Sanctity and Murder and I don't know, Broken Dreams Dead, Concluding Act of Violence. It's almost like, okay, are you gonna do some themes with, you know, death metal? Then you're picking the Dimmu Borgirian things and adding some Cradle of Filth in the mix and like, man, how did you lose the game you were so much focused on with the first album and even somewhat to the second album? So I would say the band was constantly in decline. I've used many times certain letters to describe a band's career. Some are A, starting low, going high, and then coming back again, or M, W, what have you. You can pretty much figure it out how it goes. Some bands go like J, some goes like I, like rocketing sky high from low quality to big quality. This is the later part of A, or you could call it, I guess, dash or whatever. It's like starting relatively high and then just decline. It's like you're sliding down the mountain. That's what I feel about Mactätus. Now, I don't know what is the current status of the band, but at least Metallica have said it's split up. Nobody seems to know when. But given the latest album was more than 20 years ago, we can safely say it was a long time ago because nothing has really happened. Maybe the band actually figured out they were not doing good. Maybe they grew up. Maybe they went to different directions. I mean, if you take a look at the members list, it doesn't really give you a lot of information about whatever the band members went on with. And mind you, Metal Archives is very, very precise with a lot of information. That's why I use it, because nowadays people are like able to connect the dots, like, hey, these guys went to play bass in that band, the vocalist decided to do this, and here there's not really much. A few bands, but nothing like, hey, they went to Dawn and figure out a new bigger band and all that stuff. In my opinion, to sum it up, I would say if you want to listen to Mactätus, go with the earlier. Go with Blot and maybe then venture to the demos. The later on albums are not that good, simply said. Unfortunately so, for me it's more like a one-hit wonder, and whatever came after that is not that important. Then we move to Wallachia, which is also another old Norwegian band, started already as early as 1992. Having a little bit of break here and there later on. What matters is that this band was there quite early on, but the album came quite late, From Behind the Light, 1999. And I remember this band, back in the days, some 20 years ago, probably late 90s, but might have been early 2000s, given that the album is 1999. And this album, actually, before even the album, I remember this cover theme with, towers and, whatnot, ruins. And this was like something which I really totally, like, I couldn't remember everything. But I would remember, like, this was a little bit off for me back in the days. I remember it being something more like symphonic, keyboard feel and all that stuff. But what I really didn't remember, why I guess I was turned off by this band, is like, while the music is quite soft and even, the lightweight of melodic black metal with lots of synths and even some jolly kind of themes with melodic black metal, it had horrible vocals. It's almost like you're not able to do screamy, shrieky, raspy, then you go for something that is supposed to be, I guess, growly. But nope, it's more like affected vocals. You have some effects trying to hide that you don't really have a good vocalist, and then you just put everything together. And mind you, this band used to be more or less a solo project for a lot of years by Lars Stavdal. Later on it was joined by a lot of musicians, which you can hear and see here. I mean, plenty. And of course there are some bad members, past members, bad members. But mostly it was originally, kind of a solo project. Like here it is, from 1992, 1995. I don't know how much it reflected From Behind the Light, but this really sucks in terms of vocals. In songwriting, it's something like you have like goth rock meeting black metal, and then a lot of synthesizer. It's a little bit like, I don't know, a weird beast, a mutant of sorts. There are parts where I get it, but people are liking, like somebody has given this 96%. I wouldn't go probably more than 65 or maybe that. Anyway, the thing here is, while this says symphonic black metal, I think it's with quotation marks because it's not really that symphonic. Yes, it has a lot of keyboards. Yes, it has a lot of melodics and all that stuff, but it's not really extreme in the sense of we're talking about black metal, for fuck's sake. And that alone is something that can put a little bit people off. The second album, Ceremony Ascension, had the same problem with vocals and all that stuff. But of course, the songwriting was now evolving. It was like becoming more professional, for the lack of a better word. That is, you kind of have, like, you can figure it out easily, like where they started and then moved on. Things got kind of like evolving, progressing. You have better production, songwriting is better and all that stuff. But sometimes there are these kind of a jolly rock parts and all that sort of feels like, is this really supposed to be black metal with all the ideas? Now onwards to Shunya, the band kind of started venturing away from the two first albums, and now by this time, roughly give or take, now mind you 2012, the band finally has good vocalists, or at least decent one. And the songwriting isn't exactly the same as it was early on in the game. It's not as goofy, it's more focused, and I would say I like the opposite of Mactätus, where that was on decline, Wallachia was actually building up and becoming better. Monumental Heresy is once again a step up from 2018. So while the style is roughly the same, keyboard infused black metal with on the softer side of things, at least the band has kind of like, gotten into the ride of evolution. But mind you, still it's only 4 albums within a span of, say, 20 years. And it's curious because, if they kept going, the momentum and not these big gaps between albums, like 10 years between the first 2, then another 6 years between the album 3 and 4, maybe they would have become bigger. They're all the commercial success elements there. Melodics, keyboards is not too extreme and all. Songwriting getting better and all. Production, of course, getting better. It's something that could have really gained some kind of a success and, people finding out and like, hey, this is actually pretty good. Unfortunately, they are still, in my opinion, lacking behind a lot of those more successful bands, more cult ones, which are in generally light. But maybe it's so because Wallachia was never too active, and also because their music is a little bit light, like a Diet Coke version of black metal coming from Norway. That's not necessarily a bad thing. This is more like an entry-level black metal before you go on into harsher, more grim and raw types of black metal, darker and all. But it is a little bit of a weird dude in the room. But maybe worth taking a shot. Just brace yourself for weird vocals when you go for the first 2 albums. But maybe in this case it's easier to start with the later ones and then go to the early albums. I don't know. You get to decide in case you want to revisit or visit the band for the first time. And the last, but definitely not least, is Nidingr from Borre, Norway. Now, this is hardly in the game, even in this series. They started late 90s, and they did demos in the 90s, but their first album is as late as 2005. So one could even say, yeah, it's kind of a third wave of black metal, for 2 reasons. First of all, they didn't really do albums in the 90s. Secondly, their style is very, very much more modern than a lot of bands operating in the 90s. Now, depending how people want to define third wave of black metal, some people say it doesn't even exist, some say it's post-black metal, and some say, what about bands like Arcturus, Red Bull and Zende and all that stuff, which really did something different than, Immortal, Satyricon, Burzum, and, Darkthrone, Mayhem, what have you. And yes, we could use this as an argument. If that was used as an argument, needing it would be definitely third wave of black metal. There is very, very evil presence with all the albums. Whether we are talking about the debut album 2005 or the latest one 2017, everything here is actually quite evil sounding. But that is partially because later on it is labeled as black death metal. I would say the difference isn't too obvious between the first albums and the later ones. So here black metal early, black death later, yeah, I think it's a bit of a stretch. I'm saying here the death metal presence has always been surrounding. Maybe the core is in fact a lot of like black metal riffs here and there. And the sound has been always like sharp, edgy, cutting. It's very, very evil sounding black metal in so many ways. But when it comes to the actual riffs, it's very, very modern take. And some people would say this is absolutely nothing to do with the, say, like early albums of Satyricon. Well, a lot of early Norwegian black metal bands were more or less, playing around with nature and having this organic sound. Think about like early Ulver. You can just feel the branches of trees lying around there and all. And you can feel the presence of nature. Needing it is more like, let's go to the cyberpunk dystopia, where everything is clean, nicely cut, sharp, and machine-like in a way. While it isn't, done with, the same kind of drum machine setup like Thorns or Mysticum, there's something which, in my opinion, sounds so much more like machine-made. A kind of a modern take, really. if it's calling it cyberpunk feels a little bit of a stretch, let's just use it for exaggeration. Exaggeration to make a point here that where a lot of bands were more nature-oriented and some bands were more like coming from a cave or cellar, dungeon, if you will. This is always like, we have this, factory or even office space, I don't know. And as a result, this sounds way more modern. It's not for that reason for a lot of people out there, those who want more traditional sound from the 90s or even later. But I would say Nidingr for this particular reason has actually spot. I like some of their riffs a really, really lot because they have this, evil, sinister, inhuman sound. But at the same time, I feel they lack the actual killer songs or killer albums, which a lot of early 1990s ones are known for. Being classics for a lot of reasons. Whether we're talking about Embers in the Nightside Eclipse or The Mysteries of Satanas by, Mayhem, or those classic Dark Throne ones, Nidingr really, really doesn't have much to do with them, apart from riffs here and there. I mean, whether we're talking about production, songwriting, memorability, or a lot of things, Nidingr is kind of a beast of its own. But that's part of the charm. Maybe it is because it's kind of a Black and Death that actually separates it from a lot of Norwegian acts. Now, in my opinion, their whole discography, which is only 4 albums by now, is very consistent. It's very well balanced in the sense like there are no clear winners, clear losers. It's like whatever you go with, whatever album you will start with, you're pretty much okay to go on with. I mean, the quality doesn't waver. But this is my opinion. Of course, you will figure it out which ones are your favorites. Maybe you will, disagree with me, and it's totally fine. But these are some of the cult acts that you might want to venture to, especially if you missed them back in the days. 3 different entities of 3 different styles and 3 different eras, mind you. These are interesting names that never made big waves, and I can clearly understand why. They don't have the classic albums a lot of Norwegian 1990s, early or mid-90s ones have. That is not to say they don't have their own merits and own success, but it's different, and you can clearly hear it why when you listen to this. Now, off you go. Links are provided in the description box. You will find them, and of course, use your magical searching skills. You will find them on streaming services, more or less. And, of course, physical products always exist, in case you are a true fan and all. Now, off you go. With the next episode, we will have more cult bands, more less known bands which you might or might not be interested in. Stay tuned for more Norwegian crash course from the 90s in Rauta in a couple of weeks. Take care.